What's up, students? We are starting a new section here in this particular presentation. The whole topic is the unification of Italy and Germany. And if you remember, at the end of our last presentation, in which we concluded the revolutions and the far-reaching implications of the revolutions of 1848, I made mention that it would pave the way for nationalistic movements and unification of places like in Italy and Germany. And so that's kind of where we are, and this is about the process of how those unification movements came to fruition. So I hope you enjoy, and if you look here, I want you to write this down in your notes. It's something called the Eastern Question, okay? And the Eastern Question is a AP European term of what was going on in Europe in the 19th century. And the Eastern Question was, what was going to happen in Eastern Europe to the concert of Europe and the repression of nationalism and liberalism if the Ottoman Empire was in retreat? Okay? In other words, if the Ottoman Empire isn't there to keep stability, what is going to prevent this whole thing from blowing up and having revolt after revolt? And, you know, what's going to do, how's that going to impact the rest of Europe? That's what people were worried about. And if I don't know if you remember this, but the Greeks had already won independence from the Ottomans in 1821. They fought against the Ottomans from 1821 to 1830, and you know, it's kind of interesting. This is a long, bloody conflict, and most of Europe kind of ignored the situation until about 1830. If you remember, that coincides with a lot of the other revolutions going on in Europe, and people were panicking. They were assisted by Russia, Great Britain, and France. And, you know, it's interesting because the concert of Europe elected to be involved in this conflict, so it could contain the movement from spreading. You know, it was going to happen, and if it was going to happen, they wanted to control it. So they helped Greece obtain independence from the Ottoman Empire, and all those powers, I should say, placed a German on the throne of the Kingdom of Greece named Otto I. That way they could monitor the situation. And, you know, just it's kind of funny when you think about it. You know, you think about Greek names, and Otto is as German as can be, and it's just ironic that a German is now the first Greek king. So, but that was their solution, to be a part of the change rather than let the change come from below. Now, the situation in Eastern Europe was about to get hot and heavy after 1848. In fact, this is me introducing you to the Crimean War. And the Crimean War was fought in 1854 to 1856. Crimea is a peninsula that juts out into the Black Sea, and it was originally obtained by Catherine the Great in 1783. So why did a war break out with the name Crimea? Well, I'll get into that in a second, but first you need to use my trusty tool, and I need to draw you a little picture. There's Crimea. There's the Crimean Peninsula right there. Okay? We'll erase that, and we will move on. Okay, but again, Turkey is known as the old sick man of Europe. They're kind of in a constant state of decline here by the 18th, or I should say in the 19th century. Regions of the once mighty empire were gaining independence, as I said, Greece earlier, or being incorporated into Austria or into Russia. And Russia wanted to exert influence into the Balkans. And again, the Balkans is the name of this peninsula in this mountain range right here. And so they're kind of in expansion mode. And possibly they were hoping they could take the Bosporus Straits from the Turks. And if they did this, this would make them a force in the East. You know, and so there lies some of the major causes of this war that's about to break out. First of all, it's a dispute between two groups of Christians over privileges in the Holy Land in Palestine. In 1852, the Turks, who controlled Palestine, agreed to allow Napoleon III's demand to consent to Napoleon III to demand enclaves into the Holy Land for protection of the Holy Roman Catholic Church religious order. So this was realpolitik, kind of chameleon Napoleon III, kind of instituting and flexing his realpolitik muscles and appeasing his conservative contingency, including the Catholic Church. This agreement seemed to jeopardize existing agreements, which provided access to Greek Orthodox religious orders that Russia favored. So this is kind of like the Roman Catholic Church versus the Greek Orthodox Church, and, you know, kind of a back and forth. And Tsar Nicholas I ordered Russian troops to occupy several Turkish-controlled provinces in the Danube River. So again, Russia is thinking expansion. France is thinking like flexing its muscles. and it's a tense time. Russia eventually would have, withdraw its troops once the Turks had guaranteed, I should say, rights for Christian Orthodox. But for Napoleon III, he kept pushing the issue because it was a way for him to restore glory to France and flex their, military muscles like under his uncle, Napoleon I. But this Crimean War, you think about the events leading up to it. Until about 1853, European power had more or less coordinated to maintain the concert of Europe, until the British and French became certainly alarmed by a growing Russia who looked like they were trying to flex their muscles and trying to become an Eastern powerhouse. Britain didn't like it when the power structure was going to be changed or challenged. Russia was an Eastern power. They were a different religion and still pretty autocratic absolute state. They also had numbers. It's one of the most highly populated countries in Europe, and they had a growing navy. So Britain was really, really alarmed by this. And despite European efforts to chase out the Ottoman Empire of Europe in the 17th century, Western Europeans actually now favored keeping the Ottoman Empire intact to prevent Austrian and Russian expansion. So again, they kind of changed their outlook on that. And again, by preserving the balance of power, balance in the force was key for Britain and France, etc. Also, Britain didn't want challenged in the Mediterranean. If the Russians controlled the Bosporus Straits and the Dardanelles, they would be a threat to their economic and naval dominance in the Mediterranean. So Britain and France decided to join forces to actually stop the Russians from invading and taking out the Ottomans. Next is kind of a significant event in the formation of Germany. This is why I'm telling you this. But, so the Russians are kind of being ganged up on, right, more or less by Britain and France. Wouldn't it make sense for Austria to help? After all, when the revolutions went crazy and broke out in 1848 in Austria and Metternich fled, what was the only thing that saved Austria and saved the Habsburg monarchs from losing total control in the Austrian Empire? It was Russia. But ironically, the Russians received no aid from Austria or Prussia. They're isolated. And when the British and French allied with the Ottoman Empire against Russia in 1853, it was kind of crazy for the Russians. It really could have been an opportunity for a showdown between East and West. But the bottom line is the Russians were at it alone, and that really kind of ticked them off. So later on, when Prussia will fight Austria, the Russians aren't going to help Austria. So please remember this event. It might not seem like a big deal now, but it's kind of interesting how Bismarck will use this to his benefit for creating a modern Germany. But anyway, after all, like I said, the big thing is Austria was helped by Russia from being totally overrun in the revolts of 1848. You would think the Habsburgs would have owed Russia, and that's what they thought, but nonetheless, it didn't happen. Despite an easily overwhelming the Ottoman Empire, Russian forces were no match for the industrialized armies of Britain and France. Russia wasn't industrialized like the other Western powers. They had the manpower, but they lacked the firepower, the technology. And this theme will continue to haunt the Russians through the First World War, coincidentally. Some turn of events, Nicholas I of Russia died. His son Alexander II takes over and immediately makes peace. The death toll, 450,000 Russians, 95,000 French, which weakens Napoleon, 45,000 Turks, 22,000 Brits, and 2,000 Piedmontese. Stay tuned for that because those are Italians, of course. And the Crimean War not only ended the cooperative concert, but it also exposed Russia's lack of development. So they're going to have to deal with internal turmoil. They'll face revolutions of their own here and try to make some attempts to reform. But the loss of life and disastrous results would cause many Russians to demand those reforms. And like I said, more on that later. Coincidentally, the Crimean War, as we know, was poorly fought, poorly planned, kind of like a 19th century Vietnam. 60% of the deaths were actually from disease. And, it's kind of interesting because we've been talking about romanticism. This kind of kills romanticism, and we enter an age of realism. The romantic depiction of war drastically changed to more of a realistic approach. This is also known as a precursor to the Civil War, where technology was far too advanced for the primitive Napoleonic tactics, fighting tactics. And as I said, the breakup of the concert of Europe paves the way for German and Italian unification. I talked about 60% of the deaths being from disease. It was during this war that British nurse Florence Nightingale will transform modern nursing to try to identify and help doctors quickly treat and patients, and also they start realizing, like, yeah, maybe we should clean our tools, and maybe we should clean up the operating area, and that'll help sanitize and save lives. So shout out to Florence Nightingale. And the conditions of the Congress of Vienna were now blown up. All right, each nation was acting for its own self-interest, and we're going to talk about brilliant politicians manipulating this fact. And so the breakup of the concert of Europe paved the way for German-Italian unification, and we'll see that Count Cavour and Otto von Bismarck will actually isolate different countries in their own self-interest. So we will, in the next episode, we'll start going over the unification of Italy. All right, thanks, guys. That was the Crimean War. Hope you enjoyed.